a little bit about me. I have been, obviously you can tell with the lack of hair and the grayness of what remains, that I've been around for a while. I've been doing this for some time. Winter Company is a small consulting firm based in Boulder, Colorado, and we provide a variety of preservation planning services around the country to communities. We work a lot with local commissions. We write design guidelines, we develop preservation plans, worked on strategies, conduct a lot of training for commissions, and have looked at designing new systems. A lot of our work goes beyond the boundaries of historic districts. We work a lot in just older traditional neighborhoods. We work a lot with conservation programs, and more recently things that are just simply called neighborhood character projects, where people are concerned about retaining a certain sense of character, mass and scale in their communities. And so the boundaries don't mean a lot to us quite often, because a lot of the values that people bring to their projects are the same. I am based in Boulder, and you can see the dots. This is my frequent flyer strategy map. And I'm now a million miler at United, so for whatever that's worth. But our work started in some of the Rocky Mountain mining towns that we wrote design guidelines for, and some of them, you may have seen some of those places: Aspen, Breckenridge, Telluride, Crescent Butte, Steamboat Springs, Park City in Utah, are all communities that we wrote the guidelines for their towns, and have had the perspective of how those have evolved over time, how people have invested in those communities. And like Lanesboro, small towns like that have a tourism base or a major component, certainly directly understand that the quality of the built environment is a key part of the experience for themselves and for others. That certainly is true for larger communities as well. We've had the opportunity to work in larger places also, and I'm going to refer to some of those to go along with you here. But we, in the past few years, have written a preservation plan for Tacoma, Washington. I'm going to show you a little bit of that. Preservation guidelines for Sacramento and San Jose, Pasadena in California, for Memphis. We're presently working in Pittsburgh. Well, I'll show you a little bit about that. What that means is I've sort of developed a little bit of a national perspective. Have also seen the fruit of that work and the investment that people engaged in preservation around the country made. A lot of it in the interest of what Doug was referring to earlier, perfect setup about the real point of this is to experience and use these buildings. While we love them and cherish them, it's giving them a use that's really what's important, and that's what I'm going to mostly talk about today. At this juncture, the preservation movement is mature, and I think it's maybe finally time that we act maturely, is my funny way of saying it. I think sometimes we've been operating by road for too long and not really stepping back and thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're doing it. So I want to kind of not break out the envelope, but nudge it a little bit this morning to raise some questions about just how precious is preservation or not. I've already mentioned some of these projects. These are a few others just to give you a sense of our perspective. I'm going to show you a lot about what we did at Fort Collins years ago, because it's a story that now has a 30-year history in and of itself. We've also been working a lot in sustainability and adding sustainability guidelines into preservation guidelines, as we did not too long ago in Boise. And then we developed a statewide training program for commissions in Maryland, which is online. And commissioners in Maryland take that to get a certificate. They've been trained to be a commissioner, which is very, very interesting. The biggest planning project in the country right now, we have a small role in the preservation component, which is the rewrite of the City of Los Angeles zoning code. It's a 5-year project, and it's huge. But what we're already learning is that there are enormous amounts of the city that people value, and they may or may not be understood as historic. The concerns, the issues, and probably the tools to respond to it are going to be very similar to that. All right, let me talk just a little bit about Old Town Fort Collins. We wrote the design guidelines back in 1982. Some of you weren't even around. But And what we didn't know is we didn't know what we were doing, or we didn't know where it was going to go. We knew what was right, but we didn't have the perspective of what it means to sustain preservation policy in a community such as Lanesboro over time. And I love it. In fact, the mayor acknowledges the value of the Preservation Commission, because there are not too many mayors who do that normally, as you know. Sometimes but this is an example where that sustained policy has paid off in enormous ways in terms of economic development, livability, and quality of life for Fort Collins. It began with this little building, the Mr. Pawn Shop. A pawn shop, the pioneer in preservation, okay? And you can see here what the building was like, very vaguely in this dim photograph. It was this modest little building, but it had been stripped of everything in its life, and we would now consider that to have lost its integrity, that it was not a contributor to the district. But nonetheless, the owner was inspired by the guideline development project that he came up with this little rehab. Now this is just a paint job. That's paint emulating the cornice that had been up there before, rebuilt the storefront and put up a new sign. And it was for less than $1,000 if we did this thing. But it had a huge impact in terms of making people aware that there was something going on in the district that was maybe falling apart. What is interesting is now, because that image, you know, was back in the early 80s. And this is the same building today. Now, what happened in the intervening years was the land values and the economy improved so much that a subsequent owner was able to do a more extensive restoration or reinterpretation, if you will, of the original design. So what we didn't realize was that paint job was a placeholder, if you will, for future opportunities and investment and improvement. Similarly, the Old Town Firehouse was here, and it really had been built as two buildings. You can see, and there was the hose drying tower, and you can see where where the door was for the fire engines. Over the years, it got modernized. The fire engines got bigger and bigger, and they widened the doors. And this, when the metal cladding was pulled off, this is what was left. Now, again, in many respects, we probably consider this a non-contributor. Fortunately, we talked to Park Service and thinking that this was eligible for tax credits. And it was one of the early tax credit projects, and here it is restored. Now, this really got people interested in Old Town, but the other thing about it was demonstrating several design principles of being close but not pure in terms of restoration, or at least interpreting things. One is, this had never been a storefront. It was now being adapted to a storefront. So what we did was insert a very contemporary bronze storefront that was set back so it was in shadow, as though you still had the doors open to the fire truck bay. So it was an example of expressing change and not faking the history of the building. Because if you put a Victorian storefront there, that would have misconstrued what the real history of that space was. Does that make sense? So anyway, it's an interesting little twist on that, and here's just a close-up of it. The other thing that was interesting was, as time went on, new owners, etc., came in, but the building is still there. It's still serving the community very, very well. More people began to invest in properties in the Old Town area. The Miller Block was a bar, and it suffered from the bar syndrome, which was that you either didn't want to be seen having that afternoon cocktail, or you didn't want the chairs going through the windows. So, of course, we all have had this happen in our community. We understand that. And it was reopened, of course, and now it's a great family restaurant. This one was interesting, the Reed and Doth building. You can see some remnants of what you would call key character-defining features here. Some things covered over, you're not quite sure what's happening, and probably a missing cornice. Those are all clues of what the status of this building is. Here it is with some of those elements restored, others reconstructed from photographic evidence, so the cornice was rebuilt out of alternative materials, not out of original stamp metal. What the wonderful discovery was these arches. Someone put in a kind of residential door. We can nitpick about that, but the main thing, this building is back in service, and people were using it. And again, it's still there. Over time, it's still there. Paint colors change, awnings change, signs change, the building's still there. That's why we're doing this, right? Another one here. Now today we might bemoan the loss of this 1950s bar, but nonetheless in this context, since so many of the buildings are of the turn of the 19th century and early 20th century and reflect the early history of Fort Collins, I think it's justifiable to say that restoring more of its original period is appropriate in this kind of context. Around the corner was an on-swing block. Here you can see it in its glorious colorful panel. Someone was really being creative. At least they were doing something fun with it. Here it is restored in the mid-'80s, and here it is today. Now what's also interesting is as the economy improved, the uses have spilled out onto the street. And now we all love this kind of outdoor dining, although some purists in preservation in an unnamed state preservation office have said that doing this kind of thing on the street is not historically accurate to the streetscape. And that's one of the kind of things that kind of, I go, not too sure about that. Black's Glass is another wonderful rehab, just a good conventional commercial storefront renovated. You all have these in your community, you know all about them, but the fact is, one after another, what was really a disaster area was becoming the marketing center for Fort Collins. What I love about this row, we call it Auto Body Row. This, you can see all the storefronts have been removed, and they all had garage doors. You can get the dents taken out, you can get a paint job, you can get new upholstery, you can get a new transmission, all in this row of buildings in Old Town. And the owners got together and they all said we want to do something, and several of them did reconstruct storefronts based on historic evidence. But the one I love is Joe's Upholstery. Joe didn't leave, and he didn't want a storefront. He needed his operable garage bay. So what he did was enough to fit in. He didn't destroy or damage any of the remaining historic features. He did a compatible renovation, if you will, but it's not a pure restoration. It's not a model preservation project, but it's a model project of keeping a building in use over more than 30 years. And what's great about it, what I really love about it is that Joe's is still there. The Old Town's gotten a little spiffy. And what's great is that this still is a remnant of a part of the history of the community that is also important because that auto body row kept those buildings in life for a period of time that was a space holder, if you will, for what was going on in preservation in the area. So I began to, Joe's began to sort of cause me to wonder about things. If we're supposed to be restoring everything to the pure state, why is I like Joe's so much? What is it about it? And how does that apply to other preservation projects? And we'll get to that in a little bit. I just want to show you a little bit more of Old Town. This one had been the Salvation Army building. And again, you can see the scars where the earlier, of course, when they were laying the brick, where they knew it was going to be covered with a cornice, they used a cheaper brick and they used a faster mortar laying method. And so you can see that line right up here. You can see some suggestions of some stone trim elements, etc. It's kind of hard to see now because they also introduced a non-historic element in the streetscape of street trees, but that has made it a very inviting pedestrian-oriented environment that has helped the economy here. But the other thing that's important here is now that the land values were getting to the point where additions made sense. And there is a two-story addition to this building. And it is set back, but it's not invisible. It is subordinate to the primary facade. You can still see the original historic character of this building. But you also can see that they've added on. And I think that's actually good. Sometimes we want to hide an addition depending on the significance of the property, etc. But this is showing me that this building is still alive. Now, the economy was increasing to the point that the vacant lots began to make sense. And so across the street this is the 100% corner in Old Town. This infill building occurred. Now, this is from the late 80s, maybe early 90s, and it reflects the architectural tastes of the time in terms of being compatible but contemporary, reflecting its time of history, but respecting some of the key elements of the street, the fact that most of the storefronts all align here at a uniform height, that there is a band of upper story windows. It's kind of hard to see, but these are actually gained sets of vertically proportioned windows that are similar to the ones that you can see here, but we interpreted it in a slightly different way. Now, it's not a landmark design, but it's a very good background infill building that links to historic buildings on either side of it. Then, finally, was the Lyndon Hotel. And that was at the 100% corner of this sort of grand old signature building. Had been an SRO for a while, and then had been vacant for a long time. The owner wanted to demolish it. The highest and best use was 12 parking spaces. And in many communities that would have happened, but because it already was an historic district, of course, the commission said no. They struggled for quite some time, and it was a white elephant, if you will. But as land values in the area came into play and use of tax credits and state grants, the developers were able to make that project work. And now the Lyndon Hotel is the signature building that is the icon for not only for Old Town Fort Collins, but really for the city in many respects. And you can see some of those other buildings I showed you. There's the Salvation Army building, the Rita Donk, there's Autobody Row. All of these guys now linking arms, becoming a place. And how does that play out on the bigger screen? When you sign onto the web to look up and Wikipedia, Fort Collins, what is the one building you're going to see? The Lyndon Hotel. And they've used it in all of their marketing and in their business recruitment. And they did surveys of all the top 10, top of mind things that people thought of. And they did surveys of travelers from Chicago, from Denver, from Los Angeles, and locally. And on every one of those interest groups, there was only one variable that showed up in every list: Old Town. Others talked about recreation, open space, high tech, the university, etc. But the one thing that showed up on everyone's list, not always number one, but it was always there, was Old Town. And when they are recruiting, they've developed a huge high tech industry in Fort Collins. When they're recruiting those industries, where do you think they take them for dinner? They don't take them out into the mall. This is where they take them. And it's not that those high tech industries can fit into the buildings in Old Town, but they're selling quality of life to those CEOs and to their families. And this is what they're showing. So we all understand that, but we learned it in spades here in Old Town. And now to the point where around it, well, first of all, the Old Town Historic District is about 6 blocks, but anyone within about 12 blocks uses Old Town as their address now, because it's where you want to be. So this building was built just outside the boundary. There's the line of the district. And it's now showing you the value of the land that's been created around the Old Town District. So it's all pretty exciting. So why do we do this? We all know that Barbara pointed out some of it, folks did earlier. The general checklist, we're doing it because we love our heritage. We want to honor and respect that. Or we know we're doing it for an economic development reason. We are concerned about livability and quality of life and community character. And now the new one is sustainability. We always knew we were recycling resources a long time ago, but now we're more actively involved in that and telling others about what our role is. It seems to me now that it's time to recognize that we're not some endangered species or a rare orchid, or the buildings are not put under a bell jar. I think we may have adapted too much from the environmental protection movement, and we have the idea that buildings are threatened and need protection. What they really need is love and use. And protection and threats isn't necessarily the vocabulary we need to be using. So, what does it mean? It means keeping buildings in active use, I think, is the fundamental part of preservation. Not whether the cornice is saved or restored, but are we keeping that building in active use? We have some buildings that are historic building museums and they perform a valuable function, but for 99% of the buildings in America that are historic, someone's got to eat in it, make something in it, sell something in it, live in it, work in it. They've got to be workhorses and they've got to help continue to serve us. And that means accommodating change. Now, it could be just simply rewiring for Wi-Fi, but it could be adding a ramp It could be building an addition, and in some cases might mean making a modification to that building, heaven forbid. But it does still mean maintaining the key features. And I think maybe one place where we've gone amok is now when historians survey a building, they list every damn piece of the building as being a key character-defining feature, without thinking what that means when we get down to managing or reviewing what we're doing with that building. And we need to be rethinking how you define key features as a management tool, not as a historical record of fact. Does that make sense? Well, some people are getting a little nervous now. So, just real quickly, what does it mean about keeping buildings in active use? You know, we're working in it, we're performing in it, oh boy. You know, that's why I had to take my photographs because I'm going to use those. Even in the outdoor spaces of them, we're doing things in them. Or, as Doug was referring to, these are places that we have meaningful experiences in. I mean, how many people rent the mall for their wedding receptions? You know, it just doesn't happen that much. We look for the historic mansion or the old historic courthouse museum or something where we can use because we want it to be special. And so intuitively we want to be in those places. But also, we want them to be such great background buildings that we just go have lunch in that building because it's a great restaurant, but also because it's a great backdrop. And that's also just as important. Now, I've really come to love this building. I grew up in a small town in western Kentucky, and we had a lot of buildings like this with some metal siding on them and the refrigerator out on the porch. And I used to, to my sister, I said, you know, oh God, why does everyone do that? She said, oh, it's so you know that they have a new one inside. Now, this is not a good preservation project, but it's a good sustaining project. This building is still in use. Someone is still keeping this building occupied. And in the future, it may be the Mr. Pond project in this community that we don't know about yet. And that's the perspective I've gotten now, is to be patient, I guess, that some of these things will come about in due time and in ways maybe that we don't even anticipate. We know that buildings change. We understand that older alterations actually can become historically significant. And so I've always wondered, well, then, when does the line stop about when I can alter something and it will be significant versus not? So here's a house that had a wing added onto it, and then a porch added, and then a porch enclosed, all accommodating changing uses. And the question is, would a preservation commission today have allowed that? I hope so, if it were in a compatible way that was still respecting the basic fundamental characteristics, the important features of that building. There's another new aspect that we have to deal with, and that's cultural layering that we're experiencing, particularly in our larger cities, but even in smaller towns now, where whole different cultures have come in and occupied a district or a neighborhood that had an earlier history. And we don't quite yet understand how we deal with these things yet. But in this case, obviously, this isn't original, but it is part of the current culture. And how do we relate to that, I'm not quite sure, except that we're going to be experiencing more of these kinds of things. And it does cause me to raise the question of what are the key features here? Part of it has to do with how diverse is the district, how much of a mix and match is going on around, as opposed to one that really does reflect very clearly a particular point in time. That's a key part of that. And then we all have had one of these in our districts, right? Or at least outside of it. Sometimes it's the Scofflaw, because in many cases they maybe chafe at the fact that they have a commission that's reviewing things, but color isn't subject to review, so they get to do whatever they want. So, I mean, these are fun, and you can say, ooh, it isn't historically accurate, but again, the building's still there, and clearly they've painted it and they've kept it in good shape. So, maybe that's another Mr. Pond for the future. Now, this one nudges the envelope a little bit farther, and it's an interesting story. This is in Pittsburgh, and it's called Randy Land. And Randy is an artist who works as a waiter by day, but this is his contribution to the neighborhood. And up close, I mean, this is all stuff glued onto the building. It's almost like a climbing wall, but it's all objects that he's found and stuck on my building. He's painted a map of his neighborhood, which is right here. And he owns these 3 buildings and the courtyards in between. He rents out rooms. The historic district ends right here. The historic district is over here. It's called the Mexican War Streets District, where we're working. And this area was proposed this year to be annexed into that historic district. It was hugely controversial, went down in flames at City Council. Lots of people came out against it. And lots of us are seeing this resistance to designating new historic districts in our community, and for a couple of reasons. One is concern about being able to administer them all, but secondly, fear of overregulation. And the community loves Randy Land, and they can't figure out how to allow Randy Land in the historic district. And what we're looking at is a conservation district tool to be used for this part of the neighborhood, and that might work for Randy Land. But it raises a big question, you know? I mean, it's like a guilty pleasure. I know this isn't right, but isn't it fun? Which leads me to think about new partners that we might have. And Doug referred to some partnerships with local commissions and developers, etc. There are other kinds of partners that I'm really intrigued with, and one is arts groups. They've been old, traditional partners, but maybe we need to rethink how we partner with them. I mean, this is a historic warehouse building adapted to condos in Seattle, and this is a downspout. Now, if I were a purist, I would say, well, that's out of character. That's not the way downspouts were designed at the turn of the century. It's kind of fun, and it really isn't abusing this building, and it doesn't impede my ability to interpret the historic character of the building. And it's a sign of life. It's letting me know that people are alive and well in this building and doing things. What's also interesting is the same building has this, which was a partnership in essence with the Public Works Department. Here's a different downspout. This one's terrific. It comes across the sidewalk, you walk under it, and then it drips out to this whole series of planters. So it's catching rainwater off the roof, and rather than going directly into the storm sewer, it's being retained on site, if you will, in a very creative public art way. Isn't that fun? Yeah. Isn't that interesting? And the building's still there, you know, but I mean, some people would say, ooh, you know, that's not fun. Now, this one is the Strip District of Pittsburgh. And this one, I'm not quite sure what we're going to say about the Strip yet. The Strip is incredible. It's so lively, and it has been this way. It was the row of shops behind a major warehouse, railroad, and shipping industrial area. And you can always go there and get breakfast. There are wonderful shops. And the street is just alive with activity. And there are historic buildings here, but people have played around with it in all sorts of ways. But it's alive. And it never, ever really went into decline. So isn't that preservation in some way? Now, fortunately, the local commission doesn't have this as a district, so they don't have to struggle with how they would respond to anyone who would want to change something here. And I think intuitively they don't want to designate it for that very reason. And we don't necessarily quite have the vocabulary for how to deal with a place like this yet, in terms of preservation. We need to be thinking about it, though, because it's the vibrancy here that's so wonderful. And maybe just leaving it alone is what we need to do. But it may be that we need to be thinking about how we work with these places in the future. Because there's certainly wonderful experiences, and anyone wanting to do a tour of historic neighborhoods in Pittsburgh has to go to the Strip, because it's fun and exciting. Does that make sense? Something to think about. And then lastly in that realm is my hometown, Boulder, which has one of the few really successful pedestrian malls in the country. And it was built in 1976 as a bicentennial project. Now, our local commitment, before downtown was designated as a local historic district, our local commission probably would not have approved the mall because it was too radical of a change to the historic streetscape. And yet, it's been hugely successful socially, culturally, and economically in terms of the way it has become the center of activity for our city. And obviously is going to soon take on historic significance. The design was a really unique one, and is highly valued, it's been tweaked over time, but the fundamental framework of it is still intact, and it's very, very important. So, what this all leads up to is rethinking some of these terms I mentioned earlier. While protection and dealing with threats and things are given to us through the National Preservation Act and the dogma that we have to put up there in the sense of integrity, etc., with the concept of integrity. Here's a building in Cudahy, Wisconsin, just outside of Madison, where we wrote guidelines a couple years ago. Here you see the historic photograph. Here's the current building. It retains a lot of the really rich features, but obviously the storefront has been modified, and there are these pipes that are required because of the laundry facility that's going on now. But it still, I would say, retains its integrity, and we certainly would list that building today as it stands. Would we have allowed those pipes to be installed if someone came in saying, I've got to put a laundry in here? Interesting question. How would we have dealt with that in terms of thinking about how the building is being used? Part of that is sometimes we get tricked by what we think is integrity. This is a series of buildings we looked at in developing guidelines for Sausalito in California. And it's the same building over 3 periods of time. And watch the blank bay here. Here you see a single window with a hood on it, a single window above, a very small corner store entry. Here, you see in the middle of the early 20th century, modifications were made. We don't know what the dates, I've forgotten what the date is on this photograph, but nonetheless, this is now a paired window. And now here it is a paired window with a hood back on it again. Now, is that phony? Is that fake? What's really historically significant about this building? And maybe it's that there's an armature here within which there's a certain amount of flexibility that can occur in some cases. And we need to be figuring out what that is. We do understand if you've got a building that's intact, it retains its integrity. We also understand there's a certain amount of change that when we register a building, we would accept. We'd like to see it restored, but there is a point by which it is beyond the pale and no longer a contributor unless it's the hotel firehouse and waiting for it off. So we know we do this sort of a thing. We list all the features. But again, I think we need to be listing them with something in mind about what are we going to do with that information and how do we convey to the property owner which of those are really key, which also contribute to the character of the building. And part of that has to do with where they're located. Certainly in a district with a lot of vernacular buildings, often the most important features tend to be up front. That's what we were showing to the street, of course. And so this is a small historic district, the Lothan Historic District in Littleton, Colorado. It's a series of bungalows. It's 1 block long, really pretty much intact row, but each one of them a little bit different. And so here you see the front of this house, pretty much intact, except for maybe the aluminum door. But as you move around to the sides, you also see some interesting features. This cross gable with really interesting trim boards here, this sort of tripartite window here, I would think would also be considered. We'd also consider those key features. But as you move farther back, maybe less so. And so that's maybe where we can be more flexible about where alterations occur, right? We could add a wing, we could add a porch, we could add a greenhouse, do something like that. Intuitively, we understand that, but we don't articulate it very often in our guidelines, so people are afraid that they can't do it. Well, here's a way of illustrating that for some guidelines we did in Galveston, which begins to say this is the primary facade, these are the most sensitive areas, a mid-block condition, a corner condition. As you move around, things become a little less sensitive and even less sensitive elsewhere. Now, that kind of an analysis helps property owners be a little bit less concerned about being in a district, and also cues the commissioners of where they might be a little bit more flexible. Now, I recognize it doesn't always apply to every property type. Some were designed to be in the round. A lot of public buildings where, the courthouse sitting in the square, there's no backside that you can say is less significant than any other necessarily. So it has to be applied case-by-case basis, you can't automatically say this, but at least to start this conversation, I think is important. That then can lead you to how do you address a building that has been modified, but it's still considered a contributing district. Certainly restoration, reconstructing missing elements, et cetera, may be the preferred option if you've got the budget, if you've got the information, if you've got the craftsman who can do it. An alternative might be some simplified interpretations. Maybe the missing unpainted cornice, for example, might be an example of that. And that again depends on what your budget is, et cetera. But in some cases, maybe even being a bit more playful, letting people know that I've put something back on the building, but it's new. What might that mean? I'm not going to show you a lot of the reconstruction kinds of things. We understand those. I want to just show you a couple of things that push the envelope a little bit, but in a very modest way. This is a storefront in Boulder. Here it is in location here. And it is not a reconstruction. It is a contemporary interpretation of a traditional storefront, but using more of an industrial metal trim package, if you will. Now, it depends on the circumstances of the significance of that building, how much information was available about its original. But nonetheless, the original storefront had been blown out a long time ago. And this still respects or reflects the tradition, but also kind of signals, I'm of my own time. And it shows signs of life, if you will, for this building. Here you can see the contrast. Nice and warm. This one is one in Pittsburgh that I've really learned to love. It's very, very intriguing. It's in their downtown historic district, and here's the building here. And it has a contemporary canopy and a contemporary cornice. Here's the canopy. And again, sort of playing around with some industrial metal details, but drawing upon the traditions of an awning or a canopy that you would have seen. And here's the cornice. And again, not a fake replica, particularly if maybe we don't even know what the original looked like. But we knew, you could tell there was one, and so let's do something that says, we know this building needs a cap, but we don't necessarily know what it was historically, or we want to just let you know that this is new, but still a part of the historic character of the district. I think this is kind of interesting. Another area of change that's happening is this, and that is dealing with rising seas, if you will. And what that means is defining what we mean by integrity. This is a house in Galveston that was raised. They had their second major hurricane a few years ago, flooded with other flooding. So part of the guidelines look at how to elevate houses and yet retain their integrity. And it calls us to rethink what is the key character defining feature of a porch. It's not the fact that there were 3 steps necessarily. It's the fact that in this case it was a central symmetrical composition versus an offset composition. So in some cases you can raise it and have enough room to extend the stairs and not hit the property line. But in other cases you can't. You have to turn the stairs if you're going to get into the building. Well, that's not the historic character. Well, if you're going to keep this building in use, you're going to do it. And so this is for those that are symmetrically positioned and those that are asymmetrically positioned. So it's rethinking what is the key character defining feature that we mean by porch and stairs here, just a little bit from its actual fact. And you can talk about that in terms of additions. Looking at